Can you read this letter to me? I can't read. The trembling voice of a 7-year-old girl cut through the cold morning air outside the downtown community center, her small fingers clutching a wrinkled envelope like it contained her entire world. Sarah Mitchell stopped dead in her tracks, her worn sneakers scraping against the cracked sidewalk. At 34, she had just walked out of the parole office after her weekly check-in, the same routine she'd followed for 8 months since her release from Riverside Correctional Facility. The little girl stood alone near the bus stop, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged cheeks, completely oblivious to the dangerous neighborhood surrounding her. The morning rush hour had left the street nearly empty, with only a few stragglers hurrying past with their heads down, deliberately avoiding eye contact with anyone who looked like trouble. Sarah understood that avoidance all too well. She'd become an expert at recognizing when people crossed the street to avoid her, when store clerks followed her through aisles, when job interviews ended abruptly after background checks revealed her criminal record. "Sweetheart, where are your parents?" Sarah asked, kneeling down to the child's eye level. Something about the girl's desperate expression reminded her of another little face from long ago, a face she tried to forget every single day, but which haunted her dreams with the same blue eyes and helpless expression. "My grandma's really sick, and the nurse lady said I need to give this to someone who can read it to me. She said it's very important." The girl held up the envelope with shaking hands, her small knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. "Everyone keeps walking by like I'm invisible." Sarah's heart clenched as she watched the child's lower lip tremble with exhaustion and fear. She recognized that particular brand of desperation, the look of someone who'd been failed by every adult who was supposed to protect them. It was the same expression she'd seen in her own reflection during those first weeks in prison, when the reality of her situation had finally broken through the fog of denial and self-pity. The envelope was addressed in shaky handwriting, "To whoever finds Emma, urgent medical." The words were written in pencil, some letters traced over multiple times as if the writer's hands had been trembling. Sarah's breath caught. This wasn't just any letter. This was a cry for help from someone who was probably dying. "Emma, is that your name?" Sarah asked gently, fighting back memories of her own little girl who would never again ask anyone to read her bedtime stories, never again trust a stranger to help her when she was scared and alone. "Yes, ma'am. The nurse said if something happens to Grandma Rose, someone needs to know about me. She said I should find a grown-up who looks kind." Emma's blue eyes searched Sarah's face hopefully, studying her with the intense scrutiny that only children possess. "You look kind. Even though you look sad." Sarah glanced around the empty street, taking in the boarded-up storefronts and the graffiti-covered walls that marked this as one of the city's forgotten neighborhoods. No police, no social workers, no good Samaritans rushing to help. Just her, an ex-con with nothing left to lose and a child who desperately needed someone to care. The irony wasn't lost on her that in a world full of respectable people, a convicted felon was the only one who'd stopped to help. 3 years ago, Sarah had been a different person entirely. A mother. A woman with hopes and dreams and a future that stretched beyond the confines of a prison cell. She'd had a job at the bank, a small but tidy apartment, and most importantly, she'd had Lily, 5 years old with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile and an endless stream of questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether animals dreamed at night. Then one terrible night of drinking and driving changed everything forever. One moment of weakness, one catastrophic decision made in anger and desperation after her ex-husband had failed to pay child support again. She'd lost her daughter, her freedom, and her faith in ever deserving a second chance at anything good. But looking at Emma's trusting face, something stirred inside her that she thought had died in that prison cell on the night she'd received news of Lily's funeral. Something that whispered maybe this wasn't a coincidence. Maybe this scared little girl appearing in her path was exactly what they both needed, Emma needing someone to fight for her, and Sarah needing someone worth fighting for. "Emma, I'll read your letter," Sarah said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "But first, we need to make sure you're safe. How long have you been standing here alone?" "Since the sun came up," Emma replied, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "The nurse said grown-ups go to work in the morning, so someone nice would probably walk by. But most people just look at me like I'm bothering them." As Sarah carefully opened the envelope with trembling fingers, she had no idea that the words inside would not only save Emma's life, but transform her own in ways she never imagined possible. Sometimes the most broken people are exactly who God sends to help others find their way home. What that letter contained would challenge everything Sarah thought she knew about second chances, redemption, and whether people like her deserve to be trusted with something as precious as a child's future. The weight of that envelope felt heavier than any burden she'd carried during her 3 years behind bars. If this story of hope and healing is touching your heart, don't forget to subscribe to see how one moment of kindness can change 2 lives forever and prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones society has already written off as hopeless. Sarah's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter, Emma watching her every move with desperate hope. The handwriting was shaky but urgent, clearly written by someone fighting against time and pain. To whoever finds my granddaughter Emma, my name is Rose Williams. I am dying of heart failure at Mercy General Hospital, room 314. The doctors say I have maybe 48 hours. Emma has been living with me since her parents died in a car accident 2 years ago. I am her only family left in this world. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This little girl was an orphan, just like her own daughter had been after that terrible night that changed everything. The similarities were devastating. The social services people came yesterday, Sarah continued reading aloud, her voice growing stronger for Emma's sake. They want to put Emma in the foster system immediately when I pass. I begged them to wait, to let me find someone who could care for her properly, but they said they don't have time for dying wishes from someone with no legal standing. Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve. What does that mean? Why can't I stay with Grandma Rose until she gets better? Sarah's jaw clenched. She knew exactly what it meant. The system, that cold, heartless machine that crushed people like bugs and called it proper procedure. The same system that had failed her own family when she needed help the most, instead of compassion. The caseworker, Mrs. Patricia Hendricks, told me Emma would be better off in their care, Sarah read on, her voice now edged with anger. She said a sick old woman in a charity hospital isn't equipped to make decisions about a child's future. She dismissed my concerns about Emma's fear of strangers, her nightmares about losing more family. Mrs. Hendricks actually said, "Children are resilient. She'll adapt." Those words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She remembered social workers using almost identical phrases about her own daughter after the accident. Children adapt. It's for the best. Sometimes parents just aren't equipped. All clinical detachment masking their complete inability to see the human beings whose lives they were destroying. Please, if you're reading this, Emma needs someone who will fight for her. Someone who understands that she's not just another case file. She's a brilliant, loving child who has already lost too much. The address of my lawyer is at the bottom. He has papers that might help, but he's expensive and I have no money left for legal fees. Sarah looked down at Emma, who was staring at her with those trusting blue eyes. Is Grandma Rose going to die? Emma asked quietly. Sarah knelt down, meeting Emma's gaze directly. Sweetheart, your grandma is very sick. But what I'm reading here tells me she loves you more than anything in the world, and she's trying to make sure you're taken care of. But I don't want to go with strangers, Emma whispered, tears starting again. Grandma Rose says some foster places aren't nice to kids. She says some people only take kids for the money. The brutal honesty in those words made Sarah's chest tighten. This child already understood more about the world's cruelty than she should have to. Just like Sarah's own daughter had learned too young that sometimes the people supposed to protect you are the ones who hurt you most. Sarah's mind flashed back to 3 years ago. Her daughter Lily, only 5 years old, begging her not to drive that night. Mommy, you smell funny. Let's just stay home and watch movies. But Sarah had been selfish, angry about her ex-husband's failure to pay child support, desperate to drown her problems in alcohol and bad decisions. One moment of weakness. One terrible choice. And Lily paid the price with her life. But looking at Emma now, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since that night: purpose. This wasn't about redemption or second chances. This was about making sure another innocent child didn't become a victim of a system designed to process people, not protect them. Emma, what's your last name? Sarah asked, folding the letter carefully. Williams, like Grandma Rose. She adopted me after Mommy and Daddy's accident. Sarah pulled out her battered phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the letter. After 3 rings, a tired voice answered. Morrison Legal Services. Mr. Morrison, my name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm calling about Emma Williams. I have a letter from her grandmother Rose. Oh, thank God, the lawyer's voice cracked with relief. Rose has been calling me every hour, terrified that social services would take Emma before she could find someone suitable. Are you family? No, sir, but I'm someone who cares about what happens to this little girl. There was a pause. Ms. Mitchell, I need to be honest with you. Rose has very little money for legal fees, and fighting the state for custody of a child requires someone with a clean background, stable income, proper housing. The system doesn't just hand children over to strangers with good intentions. Sarah felt the familiar sting of judgment. Even a lawyer who'd never met her could sense she wasn't the right kind of person the system preferred. But Emma was still holding her hand, still looking at her like she was the answer to all her prayers. What this lawyer didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell had spent 3 years learning exactly how the system worked, from the inside. And sometimes, the people society had written off were the only ones desperate enough to fight when everyone else had given up. But first, she had to face a truth that terrified her more than prison ever had, opening her heart to love another child, knowing she'd already failed so catastrophically at protecting the one who'd needed her most. Mr. Morrison, I need you to listen to me very carefully, Sarah said into the phone, watching Emma collect dandelions from a crack in the sidewalk nearby. I may not be what the system considers an ideal candidate, but I'm exactly what Emma needs right now. The lawyer sighed heavily. Ms. Mitchell, I appreciate your concern, but Mrs. Hendricks from Child Protective Services has already filed the emergency placement paperwork. She'll be here within the hour to collect Emma. Unless you have legal guardianship papers or can prove immediate family relation, there's nothing. What if I told you I have 3 years of experience navigating the legal system from the inside? Sarah interrupted, her voice steady with newfound determination. What if I told you I know exactly how CPS operates, what their weaknesses are, and what rights they conveniently forget to mention to families like Rose? There was a long pause. What kind of experience are you talking about, Ms. Mitchell? Sarah watched Emma carefully arrange her small bouquet of weeds like they were precious roses. That innocent gesture reminded her so powerfully of Lily that she almost lost her nerve. But Emma deserved someone willing to fight dirty when the system refused to play fair. I spent 3 years in Riverside Correctional studying every legal book I could get my hands on, Sarah said quietly. I watched good women lose their children to a system that cared more about paperwork than people. I learned that the law has loopholes, Mr. Morrison, and sometimes you have to exploit them to protect the innocent. You're talking about challenging CPS in court with a criminal record, Morrison said bluntly. That's professional suicide for both of us. No, I'm talking about using emergency guardianship laws that Mrs. Hendricks hopes we don't know exist. Sarah pulled out a crumpled notebook from her jacket pocket, filled with 3 years' worth of legal research she'd never thought she'd need. Rose Williams signed that letter as Emma's legal guardian. Under State Code February 1543, she had the right to designate emergency temporary guardianship to any responsible adult in case of her incapacitation. Morrison was quiet for several seconds. That's actually correct. But you'd still need to prove you're a fit guardian, and with your background. My background includes maintaining perfect behavior for 3 years, completing addiction counseling, and holding steady employment since my release. Sarah's voice grew stronger. More importantly, my background includes understanding exactly what it feels like to lose a child to preventable tragedy. Emma won't be another statistic on my watch. Across the street, a black sedan pulled up to the hospital entrance. Through the tinted windows, Sarah could see a stern-looking woman in a business suit checking her clipboard with the cold efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. Mrs. Patricia Hendricks had arrived early. Mr. Morrison, we're out of time. Are you willing to help me save this little girl, or do I fight the system alone? Meet me at my office in 30 minutes, Morrison said quickly. And Ms. Mitchell? Bring every document you mentioned. We're about to go to war with people who think they hold all the cards. Sarah hung up and knelt down to Emma's level. Sweetheart, we need to go somewhere safe right now. Can you trust me? Emma nodded solemnly, clutching her dandelion bouquet. Are the bad people coming to take me away from Grandma Rose? They're going to try, Sarah said, taking Emma's small hand in hers. But sometimes when good people get pushed around by bullies, they have to get creative about pushing back. As they hurried toward the bus stop, Sarah caught a glimpse of Mrs. Hendricks striding into the hospital with 2 uniformed officers. The woman moved with the arrogant confidence of someone who'd never been challenged by the undesirable people whose lives she controlled. But Mrs. Hendricks was about to learn something that 3 years in prison had taught Sarah. Underestimate someone with nothing left to lose, and you might just discover they have everything necessary to win. On the bus ride to Morrison's office, Sarah reviewed her notebook one more time. Every legal precedent, every bureaucratic procedure, every constitutional right she'd memorized during those long nights in her cell. She'd studied the law not for revenge, but for redemption. Now, both were about to converge in ways she'd never expected. Emma fell asleep against her shoulder, still holding those wilted dandelions like they were made of gold. In that moment, Sarah made a silent promise to both Emma and to Lily's memory. This time, she wouldn't let the system destroy an innocent child's life. What Mrs. Hendricks didn't know was that her newest case wasn't just another grieving family with no resources to fight back. This time, she was facing a woman who'd spent 3 years learning exactly how to turn the system's own rules against itself, and who had absolutely nothing left to lose in the process. The real battle was about to begin, and Sarah Mitchell was no longer the broken woman who'd entered prison 3 years ago. She was someone who'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones society has already written off as defeated. Morrison's cramped law office became a war room within minutes. Sarah spread her handwritten legal notes across his desk while he frantically pulled case files and statute books from dusty shelves. Emma sat quietly in the corner, coloring with crayons Morrison had given her, completely unaware that her entire future hung in the balance. "Mrs. Hendricks just called the hospital," Morrison said, hanging up his phone. "Rose Williams passed away 20 minutes ago." Sarah felt her heart stop. Emma looked up from her coloring book, sensing the shift in the room's energy. "Is Grandma Rose sleeping forever now?" she asked quietly. Sarah knelt beside Emma, fighting back her own tears. "Yes, sweetheart. But she loved you very much, and she made sure you'd be taken care of." "This changes everything," Morrison whispered. "Without Rose alive to sign guardianship papers, Hendricks can take emergency custody immediately. We have maybe 30 minutes before she realizes Rose is gone." But Sarah was already moving, her 3 years of legal study crystallizing into perfect clarity. "No, it doesn't change anything. It makes our case stronger." She pulled out a specific page from her notebook. "Emergency temporary guardianship can be granted when a designated guardian becomes incapacitated. Rose's letter specifically names me as her chosen caregiver for Emma." Morrison stared at her. "That letter isn't a legal document, Sarah. It's just a grandmother's dying wish." "Wrong." Sarah's voice carried the confidence of someone who'd spent countless nights memorizing every legal loophole. Under State Code February 1843, any written designation by a legal guardian expressing clear intent for child placement constitutes prima facie evidence of the guardian's wishes. Rose wrote that letter knowing she was dying. She researched my background, chose me specifically, and documented her reasoning. Morrison's eyes widened as he quickly looked up the statute. "My God, you're right. But we still need to get to court before Hendricks files her emergency removal order." "Already handled," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. "I called Judge Patricia Wu's clerk while you were on the phone. Emergency guardianship hearing in 45 minutes. 20 minutes later, they sat in Judge Wu's chambers as Mrs. Hendricks stormed in, her face flushed with rage and disbelief. She'd clearly rushed from the hospital after discovering Emma was no longer there. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," Hendricks snapped, glaring at Sarah. "This woman has a criminal record. She's completely unsuitable for child custody. I demand immediate placement of the minor in state care." Judge Wu, a stern woman in her 60s, studied the documents Morrison had submitted. "Mrs. Hendricks, I see here that Ms. Mitchell completed all terms of her parole, maintained steady employment, and completed voluntary counseling programs. What specific concerns do you have about her fitness?" "She's a convicted felon, Your Honor. She killed a child while driving drunk." The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Emma, sitting beside Sarah, looked up with confused eyes. Sarah felt the familiar shame wash over her, but this time, instead of drowning her, it fueled her determination. "Yes, I did," Sarah said, standing up. 3 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life. I drove drunk and caused an accident that killed my 5-year-old daughter Lily. I went to prison, and I deserved every day of that sentence." Mrs. Hendricks smiled triumphantly, clearly expecting this confession to end the proceedings immediately. "But Your Honor," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "that tragedy taught me something Mrs. Hendricks will never understand. I know exactly what it means to fail a child who was depending on me. I know the weight of that responsibility because I've lived with its consequences every single day for 3 years. Judge Wu leaned forward, intrigued. Emma isn't just another case file to me. She's a little girl who has already lost her parents and her grandmother. She needs someone who will fight for her not because it's their job, but because they understand that children's lives are sacred. Someone who has learned, through the worst possible experience, that protecting a child means everything. Mrs. Hendricks stood up angrily. Your Honor, this woman is trying to manipulate this court with emotional appeals. The state has protocols. The state has failures, Mrs. Hendricks, Judge Wu interrupted sharply. I've reviewed Emma's case file. This child has been shuffled through 4 different emergency placements in the past 6 months while her grandmother was hospitalized. Each time, your department promised temporary placement that dragged on for weeks. Sarah watched as Mrs. Hendricks's confident expression began to crack. Furthermore, Judge Wu continued, Ms. Mitchell has presented compelling evidence of legal guardianship designation, along with character references from her employer, parole officer, and addiction counselor. Mrs. Hendricks, what evidence do you have that Ms. Mitchell poses any current danger to this child? Mrs. Hendricks shuffled through her papers frantically. Well, her criminal record speaks for itself. Her criminal record shows someone who took responsibility for their actions, served their sentence, and has maintained exemplary behavior since release, Judge Wu said firmly. That actually suggests rehabilitation, not continued risk. The room fell silent except for the sound of Emma quietly coloring at the table. Emma, Judge Wu said gently, can you come here for a moment? Emma walked over to the judge's desk, still clutching her crayons. Emma, do you feel safe with Ms. Sarah? Emma nodded solemnly. She read Grandma Rose's letter to me when nobody else would help. She promised to take care of me. And do you want to stay with her? Yes, ma'am. She has sad eyes like mine, but she's kind. And she knows what it feels like when people you love go away forever. Judge Wu looked at Mrs. Hendricks, whose face had gone pale with the realization that her routine case had become a devastating loss. Emergency temporary guardianship is granted to Sarah Mitchell for a period of 6 months, with permanent guardianship hearing to follow. Mrs. Hendricks, your department's handling of this case has been inadequate and will be reviewed. As they left the courthouse, Sarah carried Emma on her hip while the little girl waved goodbye to Mrs. Hendricks through the window. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt something she'd forgotten existed, the possibility that broken people could sometimes be exactly what other broken people needed to heal. Mrs. Hendricks had underestimated the power of someone who had already lost everything once and refused to let it happen again. Sometimes the most fierce protectors are those who know firsthand what happens when protection fails. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of their new apartment, watching Emma carefully arrange wildflowers in a mason jar, the same way she'd arranged those dandelions on the day they first met. The morning sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating a home filled with children's artwork, family photos, and the kind of warmth that only comes from people who've learned not to take love for granted. Sarah, look what I made you, Emma said, presenting a handmade card covered in glitter and crooked letters spelling Best Mom Ever. Inside, she'd written in her still-developing handwriting, Thank you for reading Grandma Rose's letter and keeping your promise. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes as she knelt down to Emma's level. Emma, you know I'm not trying to replace your mom or Grandma Rose, right? They will always be special to you. Emma nodded seriously. I know. But Grandma Rose told me that sometimes God sends people into our lives exactly when we need them most. She said broken people who get put back together are the strongest kind because they know how precious love really is. The wisdom in those words, spoken by a now 8-year-old who'd learned more about loss than most adults, took Sarah's breath away. Emma had not only survived her trauma, she'd grown into a compassionate, confident child who understood that healing was possible even after devastating loss. The permanent guardianship hearing had been a formality. Judge Wu had been impressed by the reports from Emma's school, her pediatrician, and the social worker who now visited their home monthly, not to investigate, but to celebrate their progress. Mrs. Hendricks had been transferred to a different department after an investigation revealed a pattern of rushing cases without proper consideration for family preservation. Sarah had kept every newspaper clipping about the custody case that made local headlines. Former inmate saves child from system, second chances, how prison education program led to legal victory, ex-con turns legal knowledge into child rescue mission. The articles had led to speaking opportunities at reentry programs, where Sarah shared her story with other formerly incarcerated women seeking redemption. "You know what today is?" Sarah asked, pulling Emma into a gentle hug. "The anniversary of Grandma Rose going to heaven," Emma replied softly. "And the day you became my forever family." They had developed their own rituals for honoring Rose Williams' memory. Every month, they visited her grave with fresh flowers, usually dandelions that Emma insisted were hope flowers, because they grew anywhere, even in concrete cracks. They would read books together at the cemetery, Emma's voice growing stronger and more confident with each visit. Sarah had enrolled in law school's night program, inspired by her successful navigation of the custody battle and encouraged by Morrison, who'd become both a mentor and friend. Her lived experience with the criminal justice system, combined with formal legal education, positioned her to advocate for other families caught between circumstances and systemic failures. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in Emma herself. The scared, desperate child who'd clutched that letter outside the community center had blossomed into a confident young girl who spoke openly about loss, healing, and the importance of second chances. She regularly volunteered with Sarah at the Women's Reentry Program, reading stories to the children of incarcerated mothers. "Sarah," Emma said one evening as they worked on homework together, "do you think Mommy and Daddy would be happy that I found you?" Sarah looked at this remarkable child, her daughter in every way that mattered, and felt the familiar ache of Lily's memory alongside the overwhelming gratitude for Emma's presence. "Emma, I think your parents and Grandma Rose are incredibly proud of the brave, kind person you've become. And I think they're happy that we found each other when we both needed family the most." That night, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed surrounded by the books they'd collected together, she reflected on the letter that had changed both their lives. Rose Williams' desperate plea for help had become the catalyst for healing neither of them could have imagined. Mrs. Hendricks had eventually sent a formal apology letter, not because she was required to, but because watching Sarah and Emma's success had forced her to confront her own biases about who deserves second chances. She'd enrolled in additional training on family preservation and trauma-informed care. Sarah had forgiven her, not because Mrs. Hendricks deserved it, but because forgiveness was part of the healing process that allowed broken people to become whole again. The greatest lesson Emma had taught Sarah was that redemption doesn't erase the past, it transforms it into something purposeful. Sarah would always carry the weight of Lily's death, but that weight had become her strength in protecting Emma. Her failure as a mother had become her qualification as an advocate for vulnerable children. As Emma drifted off to sleep, Sarah whispered the same words she said every night: "Thank you for teaching me that broken people aren't meant to stay broken. Sometimes we're just meant to find each other." Sarah had learned that the best revenge against a system that writes people off isn't proving them wrong. It's building something so beautiful from the pieces they said were worthless that it becomes impossible to ignore the power of second chances. Sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones society has already decided have nothing left to offer. But Emma's letter had taught Sarah that redemption often comes in the smallest packages, delivered by the bravest messengers, to the people who need it most. If this story of hope and healing has touched your heart, subscribe to discover more stories about how love can triumph over the darkest circumstances and prove that everyone deserves a second chance at happiness.